Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. This is part 3 of our Chapter 26 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This third section is entitled The End of the Golden Age. The focus question for this section is, in what ways did the opportunities of most Americans diminish in the 1970s? The dramatic expansion of the American economy after World War II came to an end in the early 1970s and was replaced by a period of slow growth and high inflation. For much of the early period of the Cold War era, American government and business had invested heavily in its overseas partners to try to solidify their overseas partners' economy to combat the Cold War era communist threat. But this had consequences for American manufacturing. There was a tremendous loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States, as many of those jobs went overseas where labor was much cheaper. And because of the boom in overseas manufacturing, there was increased competition for American-made products. In 1971, for one of the few times in American history up to that point, there was a merchandise trade deficit where the country actually imported more than it exported. Also, in the early 1970s, Nixon took the United States off the gold standards, and he hoped that this would promote exports, but it added even more instability. The decision was made because, based on the gold standard, the dollar was worth too much compared to other international currencies to be competitive in the international economy. But by taking it off the gold standard, the worth of the dollar, the American currency, became tied to international currency markets, and as a result fluctuated wildly. And this action destabilized the entire world economy. The economic issues were exacerbated due to a brief war between Israel and Egypt and Syria, which led the Middle Eastern oil-producing countries to issue an oil embargo against the United States and many other Western nations at the time. Oil shortages became rampant and prices skyrocketed. And this led to the phenomenon of tremendously long lines at the gas pump as Americans waited to fill up their tanks with extremely high-priced gasoline. This drew increased attention to issues of domestic energy production, and rising oil prices contributed to stagnant economic growth and high inflation, a combination that is known as stagflation. This period saw the virtual collapse of the American manufacturing industry, which had formerly been the backbone of the American economy. Well-paid manufacturing jobs were eliminated through automation, advances in technology, and the shifting of production to low-wage areas at home and abroad. This led to a period of deindustrialization in the United States, and many formerly vibrant industrial cities, places like Detroit and Pittsburgh and other towns, were all but abandoned and left to rot and essentially became shadows of their former selves. Jobs in general flowed to non-union, low-wage states, particularly in the Sun Belt region, which is the Midwestern United States, places like Kansas and Nebraska and Missouri, places like that. These economic changes caused the labor movement to decline precipitously and forced it onto the defensive. Real wages, which are wages adjusted for inflation for ordinary Americans, began to fall, which severely inhibited the purchasing power of most Americans. Gerald Ford replaced Nixon as president when Nixon resigned from office, and he pardoned Nixon, which was a very unpopular move. and his presidency really lacked any significant domestic accomplishment, as meanwhile the economy continued to decline. His one real significant foreign policy achievement were the Helsinki Accords, which was a continuation of the policies of détente or cooperation that were established in the Nixon administration between the dominant Cold War powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And they did encourage movements for greater freedom in Eastern Europe, which would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Iron Curtain, or the communist control and influence in Eastern Europe, by the time we get to the late 80s and the early 90s. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, a Georgian Democrat, narrowly won the presidency by campaigning as an outsider to Washington. President Jimmy Carter viewed inflation as the country's main economic issue in this period, and he proposed spending cuts on domestic programs and tax cuts for the wealthy in hopes of stimulating the economy and incentivizing the wealthy to invest in the American economy. He also oversaw the deregulation of industries like trucking and airlines, and he hoped that such deregulation would incentivize competition, which would help lower prices in general. Carter also supported the expansion of nuclear energy, which seemed for a time to be the answer to the American dependence on foreign oil and energy resources. But the 3 Mile Island disaster in 1979 halted the industry. 3 Mile Island was a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania that had a meltdown that caused some nuclear fallout in the region. And this basically scared the administration and many Americans from continuing to push for nuclear energy expansion. Carter presided over a period of national decline while scolding Americans for their self-indulgence and spending habits, which he identified as one of the core issues next to inflation for the continuing economic crisis. Carter did shift the foreign policy direction of the United States in this period, and he saw that the promotion of human rights should be the centerpiece of American foreign policy. And this included even with U.S. allies in the Cold War, those authoritarian regimes that the U.S. allied itself with simply because they were enemies of communism and the Soviet Union. And this included Latin American dictatorships, and where Carter called them to task for many of their human rights abuses, and in efforts to stay allied with the United States, tried to encourage them to address those issues. He said that the U.S. should focus on combating world poverty, preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and promoting human rights in all countries. And he placed an emphasis on peaceful solutions like the Camp David Accords, probably the most significant foreign policy accomplishment of the Carter administration. And this was a peace deal between Egypt and Israel. And this was the first deal between Israel and any Islamic country, and was a major accomplishment in Middle Eastern relations in this period. However, there was criticism of Carter's emphasis on human rights from both Cold Warriors and foreign policy realists, those who advocated for the Nixon-Kissinger idea of realpolitik. And they thought Carter's policies damaged U.S. international power and prestige. Despite Carter's success in some foreign policy initiatives like the Camp David Accords, it was a foreign policy crisis that ultimately led to Carter's downfall. In the 1950s, the United States supported the ascension of an American-backed Shah of Iran. Essentially, Shah is another word for king in that territory or country there. And America continued to support the Shah's regime up until the late 1970s. And this became problematic as internal opposition to the Shah's regime under the religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, declared Iran an Islamic republic and deposed the American-backed Shah of Iran. And as the United States continued to try to support the Shah to be placed back on the throne of Iran after Khomeini's coup d'etat, Iranian Islamists attacked the American embassy in the capital of Tehran and held American diplomats hostage for 444 days. And this proved to be a huge foreign policy crisis. And Carter was characterized as helpless and inept as American hostages were held in Tehran, and nothing the Carter administration could do could convince the Khomeini regime to let them go. Another issue in this period was the Afghanistan war between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. And this presaged what became known as the Carter Doctrine, which said that the United States would use military force to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf. And they sent aid to Muslim fundamentalists fighting the Soviets in the Soviet-Afghanistan war. And in many ways, the Americans wanted Afghanistan to turn into the same sort of foreign policy disaster for the Soviets that Vietnam was for the Americans. And the support of Muslim fundamentalists fighting against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was the American efforts to ensure that Afghanistan would become the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Of course, this support for these Muslim fundamentalists by the United States led to the eventual rise to power of the Taliban, which turned out to be just as hostile to the United States as it was to the Soviets. With that, we conclude Part 3 of our Chapter 26 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.